in WhatsApp group that cockshot text, right? And they reference these two mathematicians with that laws of chaos book. That's kind of a leap in the same direction. Like, we solve this by taking probability theory and like moving away from deterministic understanding of equilibria and averages. And now we can make better sense, right? You kind of update the metaphor. And I feel like what the stuff that we're talking about with Badiou, it has also a claim to how to connect local variation and global stability, right? That's the whole, I would say that there is a kind of a history of formalism that starts with that discussion, right? Starting from differential calculus through statistical mechanics, complexity theory. Everyone is trying to find the best, let's say, tools to talk about how the local plays into the global stability, right? So I think that might be, that's kind of an interesting place because, for example, it seems to me that Paul Cockshott and these guys, they tend to think that Marx was not making a metaphor when he talked about averaging or about, like, that's what it actually is. So for example, people, they get really crazy with guys like that Michael Heinrich who say abstract labor cannot be measured by a clock because, of course, nobody's an idiot of thinking that concrete labor is determining value. It's just the average labor. But, well, once you determine the average time, you get a measurable quantity of abstract labor. It would be quantifiable, right? If you have the right formal tools to go from local variations to global average, right? So I think one way to talk about this is to say for some readers of Marx, the idea of averages is the actual structure. It's not like a formal approach to something. It's the best approach. Like it's already what it is, right? And for other guys, this is, let's say, the available language at the time, but it doesn't necessarily capture what it is because Marx made the distinction between abstract labor and socially necessary labor. Like socially necessary is not the particular case of the concept of abstract labor. Like they would be different, right? One would be, the social form of labor, and the other would be what capitalists can measure to try to kind of evaluate or to get to what is actually going on, right? So I don't know, I think there's a whole debate there that is interesting, perhaps.
Yeah, it's interesting. I listened to Paul Cockshott's talk that was earlier today. And it seemed like he was very much like what you were saying about how like he kind of thinks that averages determine everything. There's a question about like kind of like local production, or like if someone wants to make like an innovation personally, like how would that be feasible in his sort of I guess ideal system. And he seemed to, I guess, like completely disregard the idea of any kind of local production, which like, what does that mean for like an artist, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it was difficult. It was interesting though.
It's interesting that was mentioned.
But he seemed to, it ended up being basically a question about like mass production. And his claim seemed to be that everything that we really need could be mass produced at the end. It seems to be like the concrete example of sort of this
yeah, I think it has something to do with that, like
like the average of the demand of everyone is like all that should be produced, and that's it. Sort of like doesn't allow for anything else.
Yeah, I wonder how does he measure demand here?
Yeah, it was sort of unclear. It seemed like he seemed to just say it was like by what people need.
Yeah, I think
right?
the idea, yeah.
But he seems to like give a model that like he thinks it could be possible with like phones and like democratic voting about how labor time should be distributed to different sectors and whatnot. But how that would concretely be like established, I think, is unclear. And I don't know if he really knows.
I have the impression that his idea is that kind of like the Cyberscene project in Chile, like you would have some software some app that allows you to state what you need. Productive units would also have a way to input what they need to produce. Some part of that would be automated in the sense that the calculation of how much you can get and how, part of it is automated, and some decisions are collectivized. So I'm an artist and I need, I don't know how many tons of steel to do something that might be a problem. So if that's the case, then that needs to be democratically decided. But for the obvious stuff, like you need, I don't know how many packs of rice and beans, that's automatic, something like this.
But I think there is another sense in which the average is not a metaphor, or is not a metaphor for Marx, because when you think like in thermodynamics, you cannot know which is the behavior of each atom, and I think this is the meaning of using an average here in book 3, because you cannot really know what how can I say that, what one individual capital is doing or is producing, or the surplus value that this capital is producing. So you must look at the totality of the production. I don't know. I'm not.
No, that makes perfect sense.
Right. But I think you should not think as a metaphor in the way it's not a metaphor in thermodynamics, because you cannot know which is the behavior of
each
individual
molecule.
atom. Yeah. You have to look at the whole system to understand something about one molecule. So,
but the thing that I find, but I agree with you. It's not a metaphor in thermodynamics. But the point is, like, this is not a metaphor in thermodynamics. This is, let's say, the proper way to calculate stuff. But the question is, when he brings that sort of idea of how the state space of a system is developing into economics, right? Is then does it become a metaphor or not? Because, for example, the thing that I found very, like, reading again those 3 chapters in volume 3, the thing that I find amazing is that he speaks in a way that's much more similar to the way that Hayek speaks, like of capitalists, like the averaging process, what he calls equalization, right? I mean, if I understand it correctly, the whole point is that the actual prices of production are not defined by the direct rate of surplus value extraction. So, Marx has those 2 concepts, right? Constant capital, variable capital. The rate of surplus extraction is actually a function between those 2 things, like the organic composition. How much labor you employ will determine how much labor you employ, plus a certain rate of exploitation will determine how much surplus you have. So if you employ only 1 person and you exploit them by 100%, let's say, you make, let's say, the same amount as their wage in terms of surplus. If you employ 10 people, 100 people, 200 people, by the same rate, your amount of surplus would increase, right? So the organic composition, the rate between sorry, just 1 second. Okay. The rate between constant and variable capital, and the relation between variable capital and the rate of exploitation will determine this, let's say, particular surplus extraction amount, right? But then he says, but the prices are not calculated like this because you don't know how much, like this number is not, as Raquel was saying, is not directly accessible, this amount of particular surplus. What you do get is to, let's say, include into your calculation the average of the rate of profit of the total capital produced. So the total surplus produced, now kind of shared by the capitalist class, that would be, let's say, how much the profit rate actually is. So the rate of profit is like a top-down concept. The surplus rate is a bottom-up concept, right? The surplus rate comes from how many workers you have. It's connected to labor. The profit rate is how the collection of all surplus production is redivided by the capitalist class, and the mechanism of that redivision, which equalizes it in a certain sense, is competition between capitalists, right? Because his problem was, okay, how the fuck, if the rate of exploitation is totally different in different sectors, people make much more surplus in one place than in another, all capital would run to that sector and leave the other one behind. So the very process of trying to find, let's say, the best spot to exploit and to make money also averages out the profit rates, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how I understand it. So what I find it interesting is that he uses the same terms that he spoke about fetishism for the worker to describe the fetishism of the capitalist. Like there is a moment where he says exactly the same statement, like all of this happens behind the back of the capitalist. Like he has no idea. He's actually kind of looking for the signal of a rate of profit that is collected to the capitalist class. He thinks he's exploiting it based on his own process of production and based on all those sort of ideological criteria of risk and, you know, where the demand is high and things like this. So he makes the capitalist into a sort of lost player in the game, right? The capitalist doesn't have access to the totality, which is where it breaks the metaphor with thermodynamics, because with thermodynamics, you talk about averages of a total system because that's what you have access to. It's not like you are a molecule trying to see the boiling water you're in, right? Or I don't know if you have that expression in English, but like the frog in the boiling water. That would be the best metaphor in Portuguese. Right? So there is no, this recursion doesn't happen in thermodynamics. Like the mapping of the system doesn't happen inside the system. But with the capitalist, it happens. So that's why competition is what he knows. He doesn't know the totality. He only knows to go where the profit rate is within a certain margin. If in that place.
So, so is that the fetishism of the capitalist?
Yeah, that would be a sort of fetishism, right? Because he has no idea of the totality. Because in book one, the fetishism is about the worker kind of not knowing that there's a social life connecting his production unit with someone else's production unit through things, right? And now we get a different type of fetishism where the capitalist is also, like, let's say, a blind player. He doesn't get to pull the strings. Like, that's why you have all these weird mechanisms to try to get ahead of your own limits, right? So I even think that would be a nice way to think about it. Like, you know, communist, or at least a way to think about it that makes it a bit more ambiguous. Like, a lot of communist projects try to overcome fetishism in production through technology. Like, there is a really beautiful text by Perry Anderson talking about movies and computation and saying, you know, what the Soviets tried to do with film is what we need to do with the plant society. Like, to show what's happening behind the worker's back so that the worker knows about the totality that he's into. Like, that's what Soviet movie was all about. Trying to show the totality of production that fetishism prevents the worker from doing, And then you have more contemporary ideas that this is not the job for art, this is the job for computation, like social planning with computers will allow you to know exactly the quantities being produced and for how long and with how much material, and allocate that without the superstructure of money and so on. But if you look at the capitalist class, they did exactly that. Like, not only did they produce the movies that justify that they are, part of a totality, and that they are like players who are moving the world forward through competition, like Fountainhead and everything Ayn Rand ever did, which is kind of like the heroism of the entrepreneur, right? But they did the same with computation and like complex technology, like trying to control the risk of moving in a field you don't know the parameters, right? So financial capital is kind of like that, like a technology for profiting, exploiting the different rates of profit while at the same time diminishing a risk, right? Or making risk more manageable. So there is a kind of similarity between what we want to do with regards to the fetishism of production and what capitalists did throughout the 20th century with the fetishism of capital. Like,
yeah, exactly. It's like fetishism is not simply a negative thing. It's a technology. It's a way to navigate through an unknown space. Marxism needs a new type of fetishism that is gives more visibility to the totality of relations, right? So including unpaid labor, including the environmental concerns and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but could you also, formally, could you also have fetishism as sort of like I guess like an extension of one scale to another, or something like that?
Yeah,
because it can be a local to global or a global to there can also be like a global fetishism, thinking that like the global representation covers everything at some other local scale.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Like, because ultimately for me, and I think that Dennis did work that is very, very much in this line, fetishism in some sense is a scaling problem, right? Sure, let's say in religion, the two scales are essentially incommensurate, like the world and the out of the world. So the mediator between your world and on what is not in this world is a fetish. It's an idol, it's an icon, it's whatever, right? But you can have the same problem with two scales that are inside the world. Like, I always thought that there was a missing ingredient in the way that Marx defines fetishism that concerns quantity, because he says fetishism is the relations between people that appear as relations between things, but the actual formula, in my opinion, would be the relations between millions of people that appear as relations between two things. So there's a scale difference, right? Millions of people, two things, right? And even is a kind of I'm not sure if this is a stretch, but those million people.
The totality of people.
Yeah, the totality of people, right? And I mean, it's even, I'm not sure if it's forcing too much, but who said that totality is totally ordered? Like, you cannot assign, a particular number to that totality of people. Like, how do you compare? You can kind of compare like the production of, 10 kilos of corn with the production of 100 kilos of corn. But how do you compare 10 kilos of corn with 10 kilos of perfume or 10 liters of perfume? Like, you can't. So it's kind of also a metricization, right? You move from something uncomparable to something comparable. You move from a very big space to a space that is manageable, right?
It's like it's almost like forcing.
Yeah, I'm trying to push things in that kind of. So
fetish.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, isn't competition? Yeah, I wonder if we couldn't think it similarly, the fetishism of capital. Like, the capitalist doesn't have access to this total surplus production, right? And like, sure, like guys like Cockshot can show, or that Zachariah can show that if you make the sociological study or the econometric study, the quantities match or something like this. But the capitalist is, like Hayek said, the man on the go. Like he's deciding like this. He's not deciding by looking everything and then saying, here I will go. It's like gossip, backstabbing, feeling, you know, like it's local navigation. It's not like global seeing everything. So you could say that there is a fetishism there, right? And there is even a theory of fetishism, like you ascribe supernatural characteristics to yourself as a capitalist, who you are allowed the 20% margin of profit because you personally risk. You don't get the theory of how that profit rate was defined. You think it's like you know, Pareto's optimum, like, oh, we get 20% of profit because 20% of people do 80% of the work, or I don't know, some stupid definition like that. So I really like this book that I know Raquel also read. Unfortunately, it's not in English yet, but this guy, this Brazilian guy, in fact, he makes a very strong claim that the third book of the third volume of Capital is like the representation, the way that capital represents itself to the capitalist. You know, like it's a theory of how to represent this social system to the actors of the capitalist class. So you need to map, like it's not only about, let's say, the structure in the sense of averages of a thermodynamic system, as we were talking about. Like locally it varies, but globally it's stable. Because the capitalist is not at the global level. He's like in between. So he kind of he needs to represent for himself that thing that he doesn't have access to. And, you know, competition is one of those, let's say, signals, right? Price is a signal for us in the marketplace, but competition is also signaling, information signaling, right? For investment, for example. Like you have a bunch of money, where will you invest and how much you're allowed to take from your investment is kind of laterally defined by the department of capitalist production, the different departments, the different regions, and the different capitalists, and looking at them and things like this. It's not defined by looking into the totality and then saying, okay, this is my share, right?
One important thing that Guspan says in this book is that the capitalist is the only one who can represent something. The worker doesn't represent anything.
Yeah.
This is very important, I think, because you know, the capital incorporates the work, the social work, but the worker, if you think in Hegelian terms, I think Gabriel can explain this better. But the worker cannot do this, cannot incorporate capital in itself, but the capital does this. So it is the only one who represents something.
Yes.
Fetish.
Yeah, so it's in a certain sense, it's funny because you could even talk about, let's say, the monopoly of representation.
Yeah.
Right. So let's say to have a shot at the game of competition at its different levels, right? Let's say the floor level of, I don't know, merchant capital, commercial capital, small businesses, but also at the high level of financial capital, is kind of having access to, let's say, the only thing that signals stuff about the totality in the actual day-to-day of capitalist society. Like there's nothing that is left at the level of working experience that has access to that. Not even wages, because in practice, wages are not function of surplus extraction. They are function of that price of production, right? So it's really weird because if you I mean, I think that a way of the nice way of thinking about this that is a bit out of the box is, because let me see if I can find it here since we mentioned it. He says,
What, Gabriel?
You know, I think it's the beginning of chapter 8 that he says, you know, this thing I'm talking about here seems to kind of undo everything I said about the commodity. I just want to find it here so I can put it on the screen. Like this quote here, it's from, I have it here. Just one second. Where are those point 1 and point 2? Yeah, so here I think he says, so for example, this statement, right, that the transformation of values into prices of production serves to obscure the basis for determining value itself, right? So it's natural that the concept of value should elude the capitalist, for he does not see the total labor put into the commodity, but only the portion of total labor which he has paid in the shape of means of production, blah, blah. So this is not the quote I wanted, but it kind of, Marx accounts for the fact that, you know, once you get to the level of capitalist competition within the capitalist class, the means of representing what they do to themselves erases the structure in which they are playing, right? Like it obfuscates where value comes from, even though in practice the guy is oriented by that anyway, right? He thinks his profit comes, this is a good example, like he thinks his profit comes from his risk, but he doesn't let the worker slag on the job. So if your profit comes from your risk, why should it matter if the worker produces that much or not? Like, it's not because I paid him not to do this. Like, I paid him to work fully. Like, you know, so the logic of practice and the logic of justification, they are split in the same fetishistic way, right? And he says here, like, the fact that there is intrinsic connection, right, between the total production of surplus and the way that this is divided in the rate of profit is revealed here for the first time. Up to the present time, political economy forcibly abstracted itself from the distinctions between surplus value and profit and their rates, so that it could think value as a determination. So you had to choose either everything is played out in terms of surplus value so that you can keep the idea that labor determines value, or you let go of everything and call value surplus and profit the same thing, and you kind of don't really, you're no longer able to make the difference, right? He says, this confusion of the theorist best illustrates the utter incapacity of the practical capitalist, blinded by competition as he is, incapable of penetrating its phenomena to recognize its inner essence and inner structure. So this is what Fetishism does in the book 1, right? So you have it's weird because now you have the fetishism of the people who are running the boat, right? Like the captain of the boat is also fetishistic. It's not only dragging us along, but the guy itself is blind, right?
Yeah, would you say that it's this like only seeing surplus value, right, from the perspective of the capitalist as being the reason that they, I guess, like fetishize risk? Does it come from like only having that perspective?
Yeah, but the point is that the guy doesn't see surplus, right? This is the weird thing. I think, I mean, I'm not sure if this is the best way to present it, but I think that the point is like, oh fuck, let me just see if this works. So like in a process of production, you have that structure, right? You had money, then you buy means of production and labor power. you put this stuff to work, it produces a commodity, right? And you take this commodity to the market. Sorry, you take this commodity to the market and then you sell it for more money, right? I'm just adding this here to know that we're moving out of production. Then Marx says, okay, let's call this stuff here constant capital, and let's call this stuff here variable capital, because constant capital, it can only pass on to the commodity its value. So if you put 100 here and you produced 100 of this stuff, one of this will go here. So each one will absorb 100th, right, of this thing. 100th of the constant capital invested. Whereas the labor power, it has that duality, right? On the one hand, it has some exchange value and it has some use value that is different. So for example, in the market, you can buy labor power, I don't know, for 10 an hour, right? But you can use it in a productive average, which is a productive rate that is higher than that. So in, I don't know, you produce, so here a guy working 8 hours would be paid 80, right? And you can make it so that you produce 40 per hour. So in 2 hours worth of work, you produced 80, right? By this rate. And for the other 6 hours, you produced for free. The 40 times 6, right? So you get that formula for the surplus rate extraction, which is the amount you paid for variable capital over that rate of productivity, right? Which is the variable plus the surplus. I think that's the formula, if I'm not mistaken. I'll just remove the C since everything has a C in it. And the constant capital doesn't enter into this figure because it's fixed, right? If you put 100 here, it will divide into the number of commodities. If you put 200, it will go 200, but it doesn't alter how much the delta here will be, the little, sorry, let me write it like this. Right, that this delta comes from this S here.
Rate of surplus, isn't that S over V?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, the rate of surplus, you're right. It doesn't have a V on top. Right? So how much more you produce over how much you need to pay for it. So it kind of exploits this difference, right? This is how much you paid for variable capital, and this is how much more, the use value of labor will give you the rate of surplus you can extract per hour, for example. So the extra money, the extra value that the commodity has comes from this difference here, right? That's the surplus. But the point is that this is not how you calculate the value of commodities. Like this commodity here is not calculated based on this, its actual price. So this part here is not calculated on this underlying structure. What Marx, from what I understand what he's saying is that since this is one particular process of production, right? It's money one, means of production I, commodity I, and so on and so forth. Like a different rate, a different relation between constant and variable capital will give a different rate of profit. Mm-hmm. So for example, you can have 100,000 here and you have very few workers working with a different rate, and theoretically the surplus should go down. So you can imagine several of these processes, right? Let me write it like this. So money one becoming constant plus variable one plus surplus one, right? Becoming plus delta one. And you can imagine a separate one here. And this rate delta P doesn't need to be the same as this one, right? For example, you can have this. But this sort of distinction will make investments flow one way more than another across departments and moments of production, right? So the actual rates that equalize this process, they don't come from they're not locally defined, directly based on this, on the rates of surplus extraction. They're defined by going, let's say, from MP, MI, like you have this delta I and delta P, like you get the sum of all of this, the total social, or total surplus, which is in fact determined by the total labor employed, right? And then it is returned here as profit rates. So these profit rates here, they are already, let's say, an operation of redistribution of the total surplus. So for example, some mysteries nobody knows the answer to, like why the hell is commercial labor not surplus producing, but still there is exploitation? Like the cashier at a supermarket is not producing surplus, is not transforming something into something of greater value, but he's exploited.
Mm-hmm.
How do you account for that, right? How can unproductive work be exploited and actually participate in surplus, in profit making? And the point is, and Marx says this clearly, is that, well, but sure, you're exploiting the guy, a lot of unpaid labor, but the profit doesn't come from his value production, comes from the total value production. Like when you exploit him, you're taking a share of the total surplus produced, not the surplus produced by that guy. So that connection is not direct, right? So we have that idea already, right? That we were talking about. Like there is a movement, like from value to surplus value to total surplus value. So you go global with this, and then you go back with profit rates, right? Which play into cost prices as well. And you get prices of production with this.
Yeah, I think another thing to add here is the way the capitalist sees it, it's actually S over C plus V, right? Because the capitalist doesn't think of it in terms of only what he paid for the labor power, but both means of production and labor power.
Yeah, true.
So profit in the sense of the capitalist would be counting, it would be lower.
Yeah, he thinks he's exploiting less. Yeah.
Yeah, he thinks he's exploiting less because he's like, oh, well, I own the factory. I had to pay a lot for the factory. So really what I'm actually not making as much as you say I am.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's in chapter 7 of volume 1 where Marx makes the distinction between the surplus value rate and the rate you just mentioned. He calls it he gives a name to it as well. Yeah, I don't remember how he calls it. But this is actually also something very interesting, because if you look at that chapter, so if you go, just open it here. Actually, now I created a tool to make this easier. If you go to this particular chapter, how do I close this? Where are we? Books. Here, volume 1. if you actually go to the rate of surplus value chapter, I think it's the first chapter where you get the idea of the representation of something. Like, so, you know, it's weird that, again, the averaging and the process of defining these rates is, let's say, a signaling of a certain representation of what's going on, right? And he will say, let me just see if I can find what you just said, Dennis. Yeah, so we equate constant capital to 0. The capital advanced is consequently reduced from C plus V to V. But he gives a name for that calculus. Yeah, I don't remember how he calls that rate.
Why is he equating the constant capital to 0?
Because it doesn't play into the surplus production, right? The distinction between
just a constant.
Yeah, it's like a constant. Yeah.
At the beginning, yeah.
Like if you invest in here, if you invested, I don't know, 100 here, the number of commodities you would have here, right? If you have 100 of commodities, it would just go over your constant and get a share of it, right? So
yeah, what if you thought of it?
Transfer.
What if you thought of it something like the money that can expire?
Yeah, I really like that idea.
Yeah, no, but like how there is a constant capital, but like, so for example, like let's say you're starting a production or a company or whatever, or the constant capital is more important at the beginning, but as it runs over time, it becomes a smaller and smaller portion because labor takes over time, right?
Yeah, but how? I mean, if let's say you're working in a factory, right? So machines are constant capital.
Yeah.
They are let's say the incarnation of constant valorization, constant capital investment in a factory, and workers are the variable, because you can change the differential between their cost of living and the cost of their labor and the productive capacity, right? So the constant capital here, it can change, and you can give the impression that if you have, let's say, $1 million of investment in a factory, that should affect the surplus rate of how much surplus you make. But for Marx, well, if you invested $1 million, that will be kind of spread out, transferred, with the exception of, let's say, entropic forces, right, on the machines. That value will be transferred to the product. Whereas with variable capital, it won't merely be transferred, it will be created.
Yeah.
Right? So this creates, that's why it's variable, and this transfers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Transfer. But this, I think, from what I understand, this is the big problem, right? Because from this productive process here, P, to this delta, actually, for some reason, I inverted it. God knows why. But from one process to the surplus, there should be a determination in terms of labor theory of value, like the labor bought and the productivity defines the surplus rate, right? In both these cases, but then with the profit rates, you would get this other arrow here. So I wanted to find the actual quote where Marx says this, but I know that somewhere in in chapter 8, right at the beginning of one of the chapters in book 3, he says, you know, all of what I'm saying, like this consequence is that, let's say, the means of representing for capitalists what they're doing, or which ultimately is not a means of representing like mentally, right, but a practical modeling, right, erases the very source of the determination of what they're doing, right? So like he doesn't seem to treat this as a problem. He treats it more like a erasure, like a positive aspect, like a property he's describing, right? Not something that is a contradiction.
Gabriel, I think I found it. Can I share it?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
I think you have.
Stop.
You must.
Yeah, I'll make everyone a co-host.
Yeah. See if it's here. This part here. Since. Let me see here.
We saw that.
Here, this part of the.
Yeah. Since in the rate of profit, the surplus value is calculated in relation to total capital, and the latter is taken as its standard of measurement, the surplus value itself appears to originate from the total capital uniformly derived from all its parts, so that the organic difference between constant and variable is obliterated in the conception of profit. Disguised as profit, surplus value actually denies its origin, right? Or it loses its characters and becomes unrecognizable. I mean, I find this amazing because there is really a sense in which, you know, like he gives you, let's say, the means to treat the sort of microeconomic or neoclassic approach to prices and production and so on as a sort of, it's the science of, you know, what appears once all this other stuff has been made unrecognizable, right?
And you know, this last phrase here, I think it's important too, because in the beginning of the book, he treats the difference between surplus value and the profit as a qualitative difference, because you can relate the, how can I say that, the excedente, how to say
a surplus, I think.
Yeah, the surplus to the variable capital or the total capital. So you have a qualitative difference between them. But now he's saying that the difference is in the magnitude. It's a quantitative difference too, because you cannot recognize. I don't know. I read it there and I forgot.
I think he's discussing like the formulas for like profit rate and surplus rate are like formally different, and then at this point they are actually really different because the prices become like a function of surplus and not anymore a function of the magnitude of value, right? And then they become also really different. I think something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just go now a bit lower, I think this is chapter 8 as well, right?
No, it's 9.
9, okay.
Yeah.
Because I found here like.
If you can, I can.
Yeah, if you can just go, up a bit. Let me see.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I can do it. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
If you go here, look at this. Doesn't this read exactly like? Let me just get some quotes like. Where is it? I just lost it, just so I can look for it again. Oh shit, I had it in front of me. Yeah, here. No, you were right. It's actually chapter 9 as well. Because we found, right, there is this quote where he says, that the transformation of prices of production obscure the basis, right? But look what he says right before. He says, it is then only an accident if the surplus value and thus the profit actually produced in any particular sphere coincides with the profit contained in the selling price of a commodity. As a rule, surplus value and profit, and not their rates alone, are then different magnitudes. At a different degree of exploitation, the mass of surplus value produced in a particular sphere of production is then more important for the aggregate average profit of social capital, and thus for the capital class in general, than for the individual capitalist in any specific branch. It is of importance to the latter only insofar as the quantity of surplus value produced in his branch helps to regulate the average profit. And then he says, but this process occurs behind his back, one he doesn't see nor understands, and which indeed does not interest him. The actual difference of magnitude between profit and surplus, not between rate of profit, not merely between the rates, right, in the various spheres of production, completely conceals the true nature and origin of profit, not only from the capitalist, who has a special interest in deceiving himself on this score, but also from the laborer. So he uses the same expression he uses to describe fetishism at the productive level in Capital 1. Occurs behind his back, and he doesn't see, and he's not accessible. So it's a similar process. And then it's weird that in a chapter on again, where the metaphor should be, as we were talking about, like of the normalization, the statistical normalization or averaging out of a structural process, is the chapter where the capitalist is the most personified as a limited agent with limited information. So you get other expressions. For example, a bit later on, he says, the individual capitalist, or all the capitalists in each individual sphere of production, whose outlook is limited, rightly believes that his profit is not derived solely from the labor employed by him or in his line of production. This is quite true as far as his average profit is concerned, right? So again, it's the limited outlook of the capitalist, right? Mm-hmm. And he actually gives, let's say, he says that the capitalist is right for the wrong reasons, right? When the laborer says to the capitalist, but I produce your profit, the capitalist is kind of right of saying, no, you don't. Like, your work is not a direct function of how much I make, right? So that's, let's say, the true in the fiction. Because at the same time, the worker is right, because there is a determining function from labor time to value in some sense. So it's crazy because both are wrong. So in your fetishism from the standpoint of labor, you assume that what you don't see, the capitalist sees, but the capitalist, from his perspective of his own fetishism of capital, he thinks that he's seeing what you're not seeing, but he's also wrong. So it's totally, there is this kind of midpoint through this intermediate point through this total social capital that is not accessible to any of the two, right? And then again, a bit later, he says, what the capitalist and consequentially also the political economists see is that the part of the paid labor per piece of commodity changes with the productivity of labor, and that the value of each piece also changes accordingly. What they do not see is that the same applies to unpaid labor and so on and so forth. So the whole chapter, which is a chapter about, you know, average profit rate, it has everything to be like all the, let's say, expectations would be that this would be, let's say, a chapter about structure, I think. But it's weirdly a chapter about how the capitalist sees, doesn't see, his limited view, what he's missing, right? It's weirdly phenomenological for a chapter on the average rate of profit. So that's where I think that the metaphor about averages and means and probability and things like this gets a bit cloudy, because you get the feeling that you're not describing a system, a mechanic system, even if it's a complex one, but you're describing a system where an important part of what goes on there, which is competition, concerns the mapping of the totality by parts of it, right? As if molecules heat, like they accelerate in this direction rather than that direction by trying to predict where the heat is gonna go. Right? Some people treat this and they say, no worry, it's not a thermodynamic system, it's just a thermostat. So just include some feedback loop into it and it will be fine. But it's a weird, imprecise, mystified feedback. It's not a proper informational channel connecting the, let's say, I'm having a measurement of the total temperature of the system, and this is informing how me as a molecule act, if I accelerate or not. Because your thermometer is not scientific, right? So it's a weird metric, the one you're using, like competition.
Yeah, this is where I think logics of worlds comes in, right? Because there's a lot of counting what counts, right? So like for the capitalists, they count risk, like I suppose risk is counting alone. And I guess like for the labor, for them what counts is just their own labor time, right? So then these both produce a kind of fetishism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard to, I mean, competition, I think, is not exactly the same as risk taking. I mean, the measure of competition is actually, let's say, I would say the metric is profit rates. Like, you want to know how much you get from investing there. I think, yeah, in a certain sense, you can say knowing how much you get through your investment in this rather than that is kind of a risk outlook, where the lowest risk is with the highest pay, right? It's a kind of a function of risk and payback, right? But you know, look at how interesting this is. Like, I'm not sure how to read this. It might be stupid, but look what he says exactly in the beginning of the next chapter. He says, in the sphere, and where he's going to start talking about equalization. And he says, in these spheres, so capital invested in some sphere of production has a mean or average composition. That is, it has the same or almost the same composition as the average social capital. So in some places, this averaging out of profit rates kind of coincides with a surplus rate. So you're extracting a surplus rate of 20%, like the surplus rate plus the constant capital will give a total payout of 20% overhead, and that's kind of the average. So they coincide, right? And then he says, in these spheres, the price of production is exactly or almost the same as the value of the produced commodity expressed in money. If there were no other way of reaching a mathematical limit, this would be the one. Competition so distributes the social capital amongst the various spheres of production that the prices of production in each sphere take shape according to the model of the prices of production in these spheres of average composition. Like, I mean, the important thing here is not the case where the average profit is the same as the average of the surplus, but that he actually brings the mathematical jargon of limits to introduce the problem of equalization. You know, like it doesn't play that big a role, I think, in this. Actually, it does in one of his crazy tables, but I think that it's a good kind of hint at how he thinks averages, means, composition, right? I mean, differential calculus is a compositional method, right? How do you get how do you integrate this thing, a certain crazy curve, right? So you can perhaps get a feel for how he is thinking these things and what an ideal average is, or things like this, perhaps from this sort of formalism. Let's see if we have another.
Yeah, I think I'm still, one thing I think is still unclear is what formally the average is, right? I guess there's different choices you can make, but like ultimately what is the right choice of like how to compute an average or how to count an average?
Yeah, there is actually, I mean, the way that Marx does it, he gives you a kind of a formula for how.
I think it's like a weighted average of like, it's weighted by the amount of like total capital allocated to a certain section for the particular like surplus rate of that section. So the surplus rate is like a function of the organic composition, and that is weighted by the amount of total capital that got injected there. So you get this kind of like weighted average that gives you like a global surplus rate. So if you have like maybe like an organics, like a sector that has a high organic composition, you have a high surplus rate. But if you have like just few capital going there, then that weighs in just a little. The global, it's kind of like a weighted average of local surplus rates.
Yeah, from what I understand,
it depends how you slice up. It depends how you slice up, like different, I guess, spheres of production. Then.
I mean, that's I think why there is this big debate, because apparently, from what I understand of the debate, the issue, like two issues that I understand that are there, is that one is the recursive problem, meaning you take the outputs we just discussed and their profit rates. Now you take them as the input of that system. So all the commodities I'm buying for their prices of production. So they have these profit rates inside of them, and that will affect. That should affect and kind of make it impossible for this equation to be stable. Because if you're buying things with that profit rate on top, now they are not, let's say, averaging out from the total social capital. They are actually particular profit rates, and that would be like, say, one of the ways the transformation problem appear. Like, yeah, people are not buying, like, you can explain once the passage from value to price of production for the T1 of the system. But for the second moment, people are not getting real values. They're getting what Smith calls the natural price, right? The prices of production with profit rates kind of embedded in the prices. So value is kind of erased from the system. Like, you can imagine that in the mind of God creating capitalist economy, he thought of values, but when he kickstarted the process, values are no longer playing a part, only the real prices of production. That would be like, say, the first formulation of the problem. And from what I understand, this Andrew Kleeman guy proposes that this is not what Marx had intended, because there is no self-recursion, because it's a single temporal system thing. So the prices of production are now inputted into a next cycle, not into the previous cycle. So that would be the first point. The second point of this that people find problematic is that apparently these two axioms, the labor theory axiom, where socially necessary labor determines value, and there is a uniform rate of profit across capitalist production, like the tendencies for them to unify. right? That you couldn't maintain both, because if labor theory is correct, then let's say different organic compositions of capital, different surplus rates, they govern where people go with the production. So labor governs competition, and labor exploitation governs competition. And if equalization is correct, capitalist competition governs this sort of displacement, right? Sorry, what Renzo wrote here is that.
Yeah, no, this is the definition from Zakaria, which I thought was enlightening to me, of the transformation problem. Like, from what I understand, he's saying that there are like two. So there's this premise that you get equalizing profit rates at some point. And that's like an assumption of it comes from, for example, theory of production prices and some equilibrium. You should at some point get like a narrow distribution of profit rates. Mm-hmm. But then that's kind of like contradictory to the labor theory of value, because in a sense, like if profit is determined by the organic composition, then you would expect that capital would search for high composition,
places with a lot of workers, to exploit.
Yeah, with lots of workers, and that would spread the profit rates. You would have like places with high profit rates and places with lower, and that wouldn't that would contradict this equalization. So that would be like an opposing force. Mm-hmm. And what Zakaria goes and measures is if these distributions of profit rates are actually like narrowing across time, and he finds that it doesn't. So there isn't this like super strong global drive for like mm-hmm. narrowing. And he doesn't test, I think, if actually like surplus correlates with organic composition, but what he does test is that labor correlates really well with prices, even better than production prices. So he's like, I think he's saying that there's no problem because empirically, like labor actually determines prices, and probably also surplus rate also determines like profits locally, and equalization doesn't necessarily holds globally. So
what I wanted to understand, Raquel, is it, I mean, equalization seems to have like a weak formulation and a strong one. Like the weak is that it's, let's say, the mechanism, it is the signal through which capitalists coordinate investment. And the strong is that it not only is, let's say, the means of distributing, and then the means can lead to a narrow distribution or a wide one, but that it necessarily leads to a uniform distribution. Like from reading these three chapters, I think it comes later, but from these three chapters, Marx does say that there is a tendency at some point to uniform distribution, it seems, but most of it doesn't seem to be about that. Like it seems seemingly to be about, let's say, how capitalists represent what they do to themselves. You see the difference? Like one is equalization is the technology for equalization is the fetishism of capital for the capitalist class, which is like, say, a social or phenomenological thesis. Mm-hmm. The stronger thesis is the econometric thesis, that this is a law that tends towards uniformity. So if capitalists read these signals, if they're looking for the highest profit rate and not the highest surplus rate, even if it's not what drives the actual economy, the necessary tendencies for uniformity. Like I wonder if this claim of equalization can't be split. You know, like for example, in Grespin, this guy Raquel and I were talking about, he favors, I think, the phenomenology, like the social thesis about how capitalism maps itself. Capitalists map what they do to themselves. Like the empirical thesis about what determines the actual flux seems to be separate. In the same way that, for example, the competition between workers determines wages. So the amount of, structural unemployment, formal and informal labor, all these things, and let's say demand for labor across different sectors, that determines the, let's say, the averages of wages throughout society. But the fetishism of labor determines other stuff. It's more a social effect of the economy than an economic effect of the economy, right? Like it says something about how social relations get structured in an opaque economy. That's why the chapter on fetishism, it's kind of irrelevant for the development of the book. Like, it is kind of not really that important, really. Like, because for the inner development of capitalism, fetishism doesn't play that big a deal of a role. It's like a social theory that goes along with that form. How do you, the phenomenology of that form, right? I wonder if equalization can't be read in that way. Like, it has an economic face because it does concern how surplus appears to a capitalist, which is as profit. But it's thinkable that profit distribution, profit margins are, for example, empirically being determined by labor, as Zachariah tries to show, that if you empirically measure, there is a correlation. But it still remains a social theory of capitalist representation, right? Because you could, for example, put the question, why the hell, if Zachariah's work proves this to be true, aren't capitalists using this to analyze where to invest? Like, why are they still paying so much money to business schools, right? Which think in other terms. So it's kind of like the phenomenology that goes along with the form, like.
But I think competition does another thing more than just phenomenology. Is in competition, capital, one individual capital imposes on another what the nature of an individual capital is. That is always, how can I say that? Elevação da composição orgânica. Sorry.
The raising of the organic composition.
Yeah, the raising of the organic composition. So one individual capital cannot do this for himself. It appears on the competition when one capital does it on another. So I think it's more than just what one capital represents, but competition is like an external presentation of the internal nature of capital.
I see what you mean. More. No, of course. No, I see what you mean. Like but for example, that dimension of competition, that let's say it's the compulsion to raise the organic composition, right? It has a compulsive imperative aspect. It doesn't, I mean, the very fact that couldn't we say that it's precisely the tension between these two things, the imperative and the phenomenological, that drives to the problem of the tendency of profit rate to fall, because you're compelled to raise the organic composition because that makes you competitive, but at the same time you're not aware of where your profit margins actually come from, which is exactly from the other side of what you're doing, right? The more you raise it, the less workers, the less surplus, the less profit rate, right? So there is a split there between your limited view and what that limited view is telling you to do, right? Kind of a...
Yeah, but I think the difference that I like to think is that in these chapters here, Marx is seeing how capitals with different compositions work together in a photograph. You have different capitals with different compositions and how they interact, how competition makes one impose something on another. But in the tendency of the profit rate to fall, you're looking at, you can think about the totality of capital and how it looks like in one time and another time in the future. I think it's a little bit different.
Yeah, I
It's
see what you
like
mean.
space in one time and time in another. I don't know. It's
Yeah,
the
no,
same
that makes
problem.
sense.
It's exactly the same problem, but you can look at in terms of space here in this chapter that we are looking now, and in time in the prophet's tendency to fall.
Yeah. So what would you say? But for example, couldn't we say that it's like for example, I'm trying to find a metaphor for this. It's like a broken thermostat where you get a static view of a thermodynamic system, and the molecule says, okay, if this is the case, I need to accelerate. So you need to heat up, right? But the more you heat up, you also evaporate.
Yeah.
But that's only let's say recognizable in time, not if you just take this, like if you infer it from the static image, you know?
Yeah, it's like in physics, you have in a physical system, you have this notion of like the Hamiltonian, which describes the total energy of a system at a given time. And that, if you solve it, you can figure out the equations of motion for that system. But then entropy would be something that you can only discover in over time.
Like a dynamic analysis, right? Not a
dynamic analysis, because entropy would be like the energy which is kind of wasted away by the system, like it can't be used anymore, something like that. I don't know if that's
that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I think that we can. What I'm trying to understand is the following: like, it seems to me that like from what we're talking, I can see 2 or 3 kind of hypotheses to work with. Like the first one is that we can inquire at least as to what were the main tools that Marx had to think through problems of averaging out. So, for example, there are already schools of Marxist economists saying, well, he didn't really have a way to think about probabilistic distribution in a sophisticated way. So the uniformity idea is just, let's say, is the sort of way people thought about gas expansion before they actually had a good study of gas systems, right? With chaos theory or whatever. So there is a whole discussion on, let's say, the limitation of the tools to express what he was trying to express. And then we can ask, are there better tools? Are other Marxist economies constrained by different tools that might be also interesting to discuss? Since all these tools seem to relate to the local global problem. Then there's a second problem, which is there's a conceptual discussion that I think touches on the transformation problem, which is Raquel, I think, put it perfectly, like competition is between these different things, like it's playing multiple functions at the same time, right? It's playing the let's say the immediate imposition amongst individual capitalists of raising the organic composition. Like, dude, you need to increase productivity, otherwise you're going to be left behind. So in a sort of synchronous analysis, or even not only synchronous, but localized, right? For the capitalist, that's what competition is signaling to him, even though in a temporal analysis, that very injunction leads to a decrease in the rate of profit, like a general tendency, right? Because less workers will be employed, with that less surplus, so the total surplus to be redistributed actually tends to go down. So let's say that's a sort of kind of like multifunction of competition and the equalization, because it has a synchronous function of kind of signaling productive changes at the level of production. It's also, but we are also saying that it has a function of, let's say, forming how it is that the capitalist class sees capitalist production, right? And by definition, how everyone sees it, right? And then it seems to me like this line of inquiry has a question that is the first line of inquiry concerns, let's say, the formal methods. The second one, I think, has a conceptual distinction. Like you can think about the signaling as a local property. So competition is locally signaling, it locally gives a synchronous picture that tells you increase the organic composition, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't seem to follow necessarily from this that if you take a global picture, that the uniform tendency spreads out. So because after all, empirically, it seems that this is not the case. Like empirically, it seems that prices of production are not really corresponding to profit rates in an evenly spread way. So if you want to still talk about equalization in terms of you should be able to talk in a way that the uniformity tendency is not such a strong structural impulse, right? It's so I think that there is something to be discussed there about, let's say, the phenomenological value, or treating equalization as, let's say, a local property rather than, let's say, a structural effect. Right? Capitalists, like it's like a contagion problem, not a problem of the information, like the global picture. It's like competition spreads like contagion. It leads people to act in a certain way, but if that's going to lead to a certain distribution or another of profit rates, that's not predetermined. Like, can those two things be separated, right? Without losing all the functions that competition has, that are not phenomenological, right? And I feel like the third issue that is also at stake in this. So one concerns formalism, the other concerns like phenomenology and representation, and the third concerns do we need to give credence, like, or take seriously the form in which the debate has been put until now, like labor theory versus uniformity, or prices versus value? Like, are the terms in which this problem is being put, right? And the fact that it was like, it spread into 1,000 schools of Marxists debating, like a very kind of scholastic debate. Couldn't this be seen as a proof that the problem was poorly formulated? Right? Since this is like some guys said they solve it, and then nobody believes them. Like, you would expect that if they solved it, everyone would be happy. You know, like, aha, we solved it. Yeah. So why does everyone trust the problem exists? Everyone agrees that the problem is there, but nobody agrees that the solution is there. That seems to be like a symptom, you know, like, is it properly formulated if that's the case? That everyone agrees, oh my God, it's true. Prices in reality don't seem to follow the law of value. That's something we need to deal with. Like, it seems like it's easily accepted. But then some guy claims to have, like, I can remember at least 2 or 3 solutions. Like, there's a negative solution, which is the law of value makes no sense, since prices is what you need. Like Samuelson and these other guys go this direction. Then there is the guys who say the problem doesn't exist. Prices and value were never meant to have anything to do with each other, like Michael Heinrich, the value form theorists mostly. Like, guys, this is not a problem because value is not something you directly measure anyway. And then there is the guys who claim to have solved it through more econometric empirical tools. Like, I would say a Cockshot, but also this Ian Wright guy, for example, who says, and it's a kind of a cluster of people. Cockshot says the problem was already solved. It was just not properly formulated. And Marx had one claim that he inherited from others, like from Ricardo, but he didn't need to have it, which was the uniformity rate. It's not essential to his theory. If you remove that and you use like non-deterministic methods, the problem is empirically solved. Like his predictions become true. Or you have Ian Wright, who says he actually solved it formally. Like he has a paper, he says, if you take this text here by this guy and you use this stuff, I can prove how one thing transforms into the other. Like, so that's the third cluster, right? And they kind of don't really, I mean, I would say there's a fourth, which are Marxists who don't give a shit about it. Like they don't even know if the problem is there. Like Lenin, for example, Lenin didn't care,
Yeah.
you know, like who gives a shit? Like when the revolution, like the best way to solve the transformation problem is with the revolution.
Actually, that's a good point. Like the whole point, like if you want to solve this problem, why? Because you want to have an alternate mapping, right?
Mhm.
So you want to have the benefits of the price system without the problems. You want to choose a different basis for calculation. So you want the same tools that the capitalists have for navigating the space of value, but you want a better tools. Otherwise, what's the point of solving this transformation problem?
Yeah, I think, but the issue is that some people will say that the transformation problem is not a problem of social reality, it's a problem of the theory, right? So Marx never really understood, like I think the argument used by orthodox economists is Marx has a postulate that he inherited from classical economists, which is the labor determines value. But we see in reality that it doesn't, because these things don't correlate. Furthermore, there is an inconsistency in Marx theory, because he begins with this value thing, but if you get to the prices of production theory, where profits are not surplus, once a first round of production happened and you get these profit rates, if now they become the input of the next cycle, no longer, like you already lose value as a determinant. Like now prices of production are determinants, so it's an inconsistency. So they try, I think most people who defend that this problem needs to be solved, they are trying to prove the consistency of Marxist political economy, right? But I wonder if,
I see what you mean.
my point, like, so, but I do agree with you in some sense that, for example, this reading we were talking about, like, what if equalization is thought of as the spontaneous philosophy of capitalists, right? So in the same way that a certain blindness in book one is thought about as the spontaneous philosophy of workers. Like this, right? Marx treats the egotism of the individual producer concerned with the utility of his use value, both as a mystification or a sort of illusion, but as a driving force. Like you do go to the market to buy stuff you didn't produce. Like this is not like a external thing. It's not like how you observe something that is independent from that observation. That is active observation. Like to see yourself as an individual producer has two effects. One, that property alienation of your labor is possible because you see yourself as a proprietor of labor. So the market of labor depends on that. And second, you do go buy stuff you didn't produce in the market, and you are only concerned with yourself and what those things are value to you. So it's an active thing, but it's at the same time a sort of spontaneous cognitive mapping of what you're doing that leaves out a bunch of stuff. So perhaps it makes sense to think about equalization, even though it's already happening at the level, like it's concretely happening at a higher scale, because it's moving a lot of things and a lot of people. It's not simply me and my labor power and buying like a bit of stuff, right? There are a lot of changes that go with changing that scale from individuals to productive units and to the perspective of capital, not of labor. But it can still be a fetishistic, or not be a fetishistic, but include the fetishistic dimension, and therefore have a sort of phenomenological value, right? So its deficiencies are actually deficiencies of how you experience something and not deficiencies of the theory, right? So it's, I don't know, I'm just trying to think if, like, once you discern these three rows of problems, right? Like once we distinguish between, so I would say like something that starts here with, you know, this sort of differential calculus plus thermodynamics, and moves through complexity theory, chaos theory, and so on, which is a sort of, you know, the formal question. What are the proper formal means to talk about this, which ultimately concerns, seems to be local and global problems. There is the second issue we're talking about, which concerns, let's say, the status of the transformation problem and equalization and so on. Like we see that competition, equalization, and the whole discussion on profit rates, it can kind of be treated as, let's say, that there is a weak version of this thesis and a strong version. So the strong version seems to assume that competition leads to equalization of profit rates in a sort of uniform structure.
Global way, almost, yeah.
Yeah, in a global way, a uniform distribution, and this is a sort of global principle. Or you can think of it as a sort of, it might be a uniform distribution as a tendency, right? Or as a sort of signal, which is, it has structure, it has a lot of effects, it's not simply inactive. So it's a signal that has effects on production and circulation, but it's more local.
It's like a difference between like a law and a strategy, I would say, maybe, right? Right. The weak version is just like the capitalists are gonna try in whatever local decisions they make to equalize things, and that's like a strategy they take to increase their profits. And the strong version is saying that it always equalizes.
Is always equalized. Yeah, something like this. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I think
also,
it becomes a law.
you can also talk about it in terms of like sequences that converge and don't converge, right? So like,
yeah,
there's some actions that they're taking locally because they believe they're the best course of action. But then globally, this might not converge to any stable points.
yeah,
Or it might
exactly.
behave like some kind of attractor, right?
Yeah, so for example, you can see that exactly that idea is what these guys use. They use this non-deterministic means to show that this is maintainable, right? It's a global but non-deterministic thesis. It's slightly different, I think, from, it's still structural, right? It's still, let's say, irrespective of what you, it's not phenomenological in the sense we were talking about. It kind of bypasses that idea, but it's a way of letting go of this, right? And still having a strong thesis. Like, even if empirically there is no uniform distribution, well, there are formal means to talking about uneven global phenomena that remain structural, right? That are not accidental. And I think that the third term is the sort of symptomatic problem, which is to say, like, how are we required to assume that the formulation of the problem is correct? Given that we have this situation today where, you know, everyone agrees on problem, nobody on the solution, right? So the reason why I'm writing all of this together is because it seems to me like these three things might actually relate. If you have some other formal means to approach it, it might lead you to formulate the problem differently, right? Which might lead you to also have, let's say, a different kind of reading of that part, where perhaps the way it's expressed, it might remain problematic, but it might be problematic in a different way, right?
All right, I gotta head out now. This is interesting though. We'll see you guys.
Great.
Happy birthday, Yasha.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, happy
Oh,
birthday.
thank you.
Renzo said it's narrow instead of uniform. Yeah, because I mean, I think the point is that they assumed. I mean, the reading is that Marx would assume that the profit rate is kind of generally similar throughout sectors of
Like
productive.
spatially uniform, not like I see what you mean. So
Yeah, it wouldn't be, let's say, different organic compositions wouldn't affect the curve of where profit rates are higher or lower ultimately, because it would be spread, right, and not narrow in certain sectors, right?
Yeah, because I was thinking about the distribution of profit rates. It would be a narrow distribution because they would be all the same, because they're just
I see. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if I'm reading all of this right. Like, I'm not sure if this is the best way to state this stuff. Like, this part here, if this is a nice way of putting it, you know, I'm not sure if it is. It might not be. But I don't know. I find it interesting. For example, I found it kind of serendipitous, or whatever, however you say it, that, you know, Raquel, that you've been studying these things and you got interested in the problem of visualizing crisis, like this triad of crisis as something that reveals something. The whole thing you were talking about Eisenstein and filming capital, and this sort of what it means to film something like this, what it means to picture it, right? And also book 3 and equalization problems and things like this, like that there is this sort of intuition also that you were following, that these things are kind of connected. It's not very obvious, I think, you know, that representation and equalization, that's an approach to this issue, you know. You could simply state that it is a technical structural effect, and treat it as something totally disconnected from this kind of phenomenology, you know. So I find it interesting that you also found this.
And I think when I think about this, the equalization problem with some method of representation side, it's because it's like what I was saying before. The only we can think about two those poles, two poles. You can say two poles. I don't know.
Poles, yeah.
Yeah. So you can think about two poles. One of them is capital, another is the worker. The only pole that represents something is capital. So when I think about a method of representation, we are always representing something from the point of view of capital. And when I think about Eisenstein and what he talks about when he says that when you put a frame aside another, in fact, what you're doing is not putting one in the side of the other, but superposing them and trying to maintain the tension, trying to not eliminate the contradiction. And I think this is the whole question that I'm thinking, because equalization and the tendency of the profit rate to fall doesn't eliminate the contradiction. And this kind of representation that Eisenstein talks about doesn't eliminate the contradiction either. You maintain it by superposing the frames, and like in the example that he talks about, I forgot the name of the text, but when he talks about the lions in oh my god, forgot the name. Just
The lion.
the lions of the sorry, I'm going to just a minute.
The lion came up again in the
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah.
The lions of sorry, I forgot the name of the film. The lions of shit.
But Eisenstein's movie.
Yeah, that one from the whole people are in the oh my
Submarine.
God.
The battleship.
Yeah, the
Potemkin.
Battleship
Potemkin.
Potemkin. Yeah. Sorry for that. But when he talks about the lions, that the lion seems to be moving, is that because he superposes three images of lions. One of them is a lion that is still, another is a lion that is awakening, and another one is another thing. But the thing is that what he's trying to show is that he's trying to invent some technique of representation that maintains the contradiction, that maintains tension, not eliminate it.
Mhm.
And I think what equalization does, when I say that competition is a kind of way of thinking, something that capital alone cannot do it to itself. A capitalist cannot think by himself, I must rise my organic composition. It doesn't work like that. It's another capital that imposes it to him. So I think the competition, in a way, maintains this tension, like Eisenstein is talking about in the film. But here in the equalization problem, I think I don't know if I agree with you, Gabriel, when you say that in the second, when you were drawing that columns, in the second column, I don't know if the uniformization is the problem here. I don't know how to explain it, but I think that the main problem for Marx, and he says it a lot of times in Grundrisse, more than in Capital, I think, is that competition is something that appears as an external force of the internal nature of capital.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter if all individual capitals are going to relate to this external force. The question is, what is this external force? Why something that is internal, like when you think about the concept of mercadoria, how do you say mercadoria?
Commodity.
Commodity, sorry. When you think about the concept of commodity, it's the same thing. You have internal contradiction, internal opposition that has to express itself in an external opposition. The exchange value and the use
value.
Use value. You can only think about this opposition in an external opposition that is the price.
Yeah.
And it appears in the same logic in the competition. You cannot think alone about the nature of the individual capital, but just on the external force that is competition.
Yeah.
So I think there is something more there.
But I think that I would just I don't want to. I understand what you're saying. I just want to correct that. I'm not suggesting that, for example, that mechanism through which, you know, the value of a commodity, it can only be expressed in another commodity. It's not like I can see it myself, but then there is also the other commodity. No, you can, that's, let's say, objective phenomenology. That's what I'm trying to get to. Like, it's not, you can totally eliminate the interiority or the idea of experience or the idea of that representations are representations for a person. But the fact is that the only appearance of value is in another commodity. Like, the body of a commodity is at the same time that it's a material thing, therefore a use value, it is the incarnation of the value of the other. It's like a material theory of something, of appearance, right? That's why he also uses this Christianity example, because Christianity, it has a very weird phenomenology that says that a man is the appearance of God, right? Or that a king is the appearance of the totality of citizens. So like, it can only appear in an external form. You cannot appear, there is no internal access or immediate access. The mediation is also what makes it appear, right? I think that what led Dennis and I to bring Badiou into the picture is because, and I think that I was mistaken not to make this clear, is that what we are calling phenomenology is the same thing. It's like, it's material expression of a logic on things. It's absolutely objective. It's not a matter of how you represent for yourself in your mental space. Like, that's actually a third level that we could call conscious. So like, what's cool about Badiou's phenomenology is that it doesn't presuppose this at all. Like, it tries to explain why it is that in a certain world, certain things have a higher existence than others. Or, for example, why, we were talking about this yesterday, what it takes for a relation to appear. And for him, relations need to appear in objects. Relations cannot appear as relations. So there is no, for example, there would be no value relation if there wasn't an object that embodies the value. Actually, now that I see of it, we should have thought about this yesterday, Dennis.
Yeah, that's a good.
That's actually what he was saying. But so what I mean, like, by phenomenology is not how the capitalist sees inside what he's doing, but like, why is it that he can only see the problem of organic composition that he is faced with by looking at another, right? The other incarnates, let's say, the compulsion, or the other incarnates the form of productivity that, after all, he's himself plagued with. So there is no other solution. Like, you cannot do it by yourself. It's not a matter of rational justification or personal experience. It's totally objective, but it's at the same time weirdly contingent, because the things that you're actually seeing when you see this is like, is the owner of a shop is not, you're not seeing an imposition. You're seeing another guy with some employees and machines. How is it that when you see another guy with employees and machines, you actually see competition, right? That external force, which is the weird problem of value as well. How is it that when you see a paper, you're actually seeing value and not paper, right? So I mean, I should have corrected that. It's not a way to weaken the structural argument or the logical argument, but it's just that there is a certain sense in which you can talk about logic in a local way. So that connection makes it a weird, it's local, therefore it's the appearance and not the being, the transcendental being of something. It's local, it might not add up. It might be contingent or something like this, but it's still asubjective and purely logical, like as an external force or a law or a tendency or something like this, right? So I totally agree with you. I think it's a bad. It would be a bad reading of, like, it would be wrong. I wouldn't agree with myself if you were to claim like it's a matter of representing for yourself what's going on.
But Gabriel, why do you think uniformization can make this this theory poorer?
My point is that, I mean, it seems to me that there is a claim today that empirically the cross-sector uniformization doesn't hold, like empirically. Like if you measure, you should let go of the theory of equalization because it's empirically untrue. Okay. That's what I was saying. So it seems to me that if you think that equalization is like the classical debate would be, if you think equalization is correct, you should also believe that the uniformity of profit rates is correct. And if therefore I show you that with data it's not true, you should let it go. But it feels like it would mean letting go of too much. Like we don't want to let it go because it doesn't seem to be so central. It doesn't seem to be so much about this uniformity law, and more about, let's say, the very structure of competition, right? I mean, it's more about putting things into motion than telling where they're gonna go. Right, I think that's, I mean, and I didn't mean to say that it's putting things into motion because the capitalist believes internally that this is the case. So like, forget about that. But still, usually we would be trapped. Either it is the law of motion, like it's not the law of motivation, it's the law of motion. So it's not only the external force to which you react, it's the external force and the distribution of that movement later on. It's the law of the movement of what you're gonna do, right? And I'm wondering if it is impossible to separate the two things, to say, okay, I can accept that empirically this competition doesn't lead to this particular equilibria. It might lead to, it might be lead to kind of unpredictable equilibria, but I don't need to let go of the theory of equalization because of that, because it also has, I mean, it's the strong claim, the most important thing about it is actually, let's say, explaining the forces through which capitalists react, let's say the real forces to which they react, more than what is going to happen once they react, right? Like, I wonder if we can't separate the two things. And I feel like appearing, like the appearance is a good name for how something externally appears to you, like how something forces itself onto you. That's how it appears. If I agree that there is a big prejudice or a common sense that phenomenology is not about that. Phenomenology is about how it appears to you as a conscious subject. But since Marx already did so much work to show that, I mean, he still uses notions of what capitalists see, what capitalists represent, what capitalists are doing, but he's not talking about, like he always said, like, I'm not talking about people, I'm talking about like just a function. So it's not a matter of how things appear to a person, it's how they appear to the function.
Yeah.
So you need a theory of appearance without people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what, for example, Dennis's text on phenomenology, I think that's what he was trying to do. Like, this fits what we're calling like a phenomenon. We can talk about appearance without talking about people seeing stuff, right? And I think that that's actually a really good point, because to go back to movies and Soviet movies, like once we started talking about this, I started trying to remember like Soviet film strategies to deal with this. And I think that the most obvious one is not even Eisenstein, because weirdly enough, Eisenstein had seemed to have a theory that you should bypass representation, right, to produce effects. So much of it was about shock and like sensible reactions, not really about seeing like oh, the worker and seeing this and that. Like, I think that's a lot due to the fact that he was perhaps more of a Russian filmmaker than a Soviet filmmaker. Like, he is very much in tune with a Russian aesthetics, you know, and not only like trying to develop the aesthetics that come from the revolution or already. No wonder that he was better equipped to be the state filmmaker than the vanguard filmmakers, I think. He has an epic, he knows about epic movies and about the role of sensibility in movies in a way that like intellectual formalisms didn't really do. But like a guy like Vertov, who tried to do this on purpose, you know, it's interesting. Like I was remembering like Man with a Movie Camera. Like the only way he can do this is by anthropomorphizing the totality. Like the whole beginning of the movie, he tries to educate your gaze how to look at the movie by showing you shots of people waking up and doing morning activities and the city waking up. So a person blinks and then or opens their eyes and a window goes open. A person brushes the teeth and somebody cleans a shop. So he establishes like a parallelism, right? And then when the parallelism starts going off, because you're no longer people in the house and the city that's big, you get people in the city doing things and the two levels are mixed. He needs to put one person in the middle, like the person that is the eye, which is a man with the movie camera. Like, and he is always like, he's convinced that if you show the image and then show the person taking the image, making the image, or situate the person inside the film space, so you're always following that guy. He kind of is the mediator between small and big, right? So it's very hard to suggest that the city appears to something which is not a person. Like, it's funny because he thinks he's defetishizing, because he's showing how images are produced, he's showing the filmmaker, he's showing the crew, but he's fetishizing the city because it's as if social reality appears to people and not to itself, right? Like when a guy has a firm and he is deciding what to do to buy more resources, to pay more people, to let someone go, it's not his feelings that tell him what to do. It's like numbers, the budget, they're like mediating things without which you cannot kind of see what's going on, right? Like as if the reality is not in your measure. You need kind of other organs to see the social world, I think. And I find that sometimes in socialist imagination, there is this desire that things appear to us, like the good society will be transparent to me. Like I will know where I am, you know, personally. So like an objective phenomenology that suggests that in general, things don't appear to you to begin with. Like things appear, it's not to you, and you have to find a way to know how things appear to you because that's not a given, right? So for example, for Badiou, art kind of does that. Like you don't know what you see until somebody paints and you say, that scene is very Turner-like. Like the mediation tells you what you're seeing. Like you don't know how things appear to you. It's not like mysterious or hidden, but appearance is not like a intentional or personal function. Like it's objective. It's not to you. I find that that's useful because even these guys in Soviet movies trying to come up with a way of showing totality, they have a really hard time not assuming that the best way to do that is to imagine the subject and everything comes to him, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
and that's no,
yeah.
please continue.
No, please say.
No, because another thing that I was trying to think when I tried to think about an image that could represent some concepts of crisis. And I was thinking about the indirect speech. I talked to you about in Ulysses from James Joyce, and I think it's very similar from what you were talking about, because the concept of indirect speech is a narrator, a storyteller that goes inside the mind of some character and tells what is going on inside his mind. And what we know about the scene, about what is happening in the book, is the storyteller, the narrator, showing us what is going on inside the mind of some character.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I always say that if Capital was a book, if you think about it as literature, I think it will be written in indirect speech, because it's like we are seeing some storyteller telling us what goes in the mind of Capital, not capitalist,
Mm-hmm.
but in the mind of the Capital as a subject. And it has something similar to what Joyce does, because there is some moments that the narrator or the storyteller assumes some features from the character to tell better what is going on in his mind. And I think Marx does this too. He thinks like Capital would think to show show better what is going on. And but I think that this movement to show something about from a narrator, from something that is outside, I think it's the same structure that we are thinking here in these chapters of Equalization. You know, there is something, there is some force that is driving, that appears in the mind of character, and this is all that we see. It is very important. We don't see, the capitalist don't see the scene as a whole. He doesn't see every feature of the competition. We just see what we see about competition is just the mind of one capital. What he's thinking in those moments, in such moments.
But that's a really interesting idea, because for example, one thing that I always found very interesting is that there is a long history of texts that try to make transparent capitalism. And the only way that you can find to do it is to adopt the standpoint of the commodity talking. Like prosopopeia, you know, like it's a very kind of classic. Have you seen this text called I, the pen, I, the pencil, me, the pencil? I don't know how it's called. It's a text written in 1930 that it's an attempt to disprove socialism by having a pencil talk about its production process, where it's been. And the pencil says, well, I've been, you know, like, I was a tree, and then somebody cut the tree, but I was also, let me see, I think Dennis sent it here. Like, it's very crazy. It's actually quite nice.
Yeah.
See if it opens. So it's basically like the pencil telling of a story that everyone was a side character in it. Nobody was the main character. The thing is the main character, and people are like things, like they just appear in the sides. So, and the pencil is like trying to teach a lesson by saying, you think that capitalism is egotistical and everyone is concerned only with their own problems, but in fact, you just are part of a big network of people that are getting fed because I was produced. Like, when they took the trees out of the forest, some people were paid for this, and they lived their lives, and they had friends that they used the money to help. And then I was transported, and the guy who transported me also got money for this, and this changed his life. So from your perspective, you're limited, but mine is the total perspective. Like the perspective of the thing is a total perspective, and the prosopopeia is the right discourse, is not the metaphor. So the first person is the metaphor. The prosopopeia is the proper speech. Like I think the idea of indirect speech being the correct, and the first person is like a quotation, like a, it's like a, it's the like the indirect of the indirect, right? When the capitalist speaks in the first person, he's like, that's the indirect speech, right? And true
exactly
is the most direct you can get. It's a similar strategy, you know. And I feel like this is it really plays nicely into this idea of a phenomenology without a subject, because it appears to the pen, to the pencil. It doesn't appear to the worker. Like if you want to find the right angle or the right language, right? The whole theory of the language of commodities, like that whole expression, it wouldn't be a metaphor. It would be the right description. Like you don't understand the vocabulary if you think people are talking to you. They're talking, commodities are talking between them, right? And when capitalists talk between them, that's actually more ventriloquy than like proper enunciation, right? I think that's like a really good way to talk about this problem. But and it connects, you know, crisis and the problem of competition and equalization with a sort of phenomenology without the subject, I think. But what I find
we can extend that to like how capital, an individual capital, interacts with other individual capitals, right? So on. I mean, you can scale this up however much, you know.
And I think that this is the crazy thing about the equalization problem and the whole equalization discussion, which is when you were supposed to reach the level where people speak in the first person and they're not constrained by external forces, they're still constrained and they're still doing the ventriloquy. So you don't get somebody on top who sees things better. It's fetishism all the way up. You know, you don't get something out of that, which is, let's say, the last place that we still kind of keep in our minds. That is where transparency is hidden, right? And therefore, if somebody has a transparent view, it's a good idea to desire transparency. Like I think that's the jump, you know. If capitalists have access to how things really are, if they can speak in the first person, then we can wish for a democratization of that. And socialism can be the project of diminishing the opaque society and making it transparent, because that is possible. If competition is a compulsion and it is a partial view and not a total view, and if it's a view that is, let's say, if the capitalist speaking in the first person is a prosopopeia, where and the things remain for him, capital remains for him, kind of separated, then it kind of leads to the idea that it's, well, you can't really expect to overcome this by democratizing transparency, because perhaps you need a different form of opaqueness, right? I just wanted to find a nice quote here.
But I think there's a lot we can draw from certain areas of math to formalize this opaqueness between systems, right? Because it's kind of like a dialogue between formal entities. And we could say that the opaqueness can be thought of as like an obstacle in a topological sense, or in a sense in which a certain mapping fails to obey some kind of transitivity. So like we have a system that we can't see completely, and then we have maps of that system. So maps being like some set of observable things about that system, things that we can perceive about the system. And then the behavior of the maps does not match the behavior of the systems, something like that. And then I think the key twist there is not simply because we don't see the whole picture, but because there is something materially blocking or an obstacle that prevents this map from being complete.
Yeah, but I think that the issue there is another way of saying the same thing. I think is that I think we spoke of this once. Like I tried to do this thing here, which I think plays into that. You can have 4 big positions on, in my opinion, on the relation between the analytic and the political, or the economic and the political sides of capitalist and anti-capitalist struggle. Like the first position says capitalism is actually made of people, so it's a personal form of domination. And which implies it's transparent in some sense, like it's ultimately intentional because it's ultimately personal, and therefore our critique of it is also personal. So we desire personal emancipation. So what is, let's say, an elite? What the elite has access. In an emancipatory society, everyone has access, right? But you can, I would say this is, let's say, it has a problem because it assumes capitalism is just the people, but it has a nice idea, which is it fights fire with fire, right? You have personal, and then you get personal interventions. Then you have the people who say capitalism is an impersonal form of domination.
Since you have markets.
For example, because we have markets and they dominate, and we have capital is not reducible to the capitalists. Billionaires, killing billionaires will not solve everything, that idea. But you say, but that's precisely why we need personal emancipation. So let's say this is abstract and mediated, and that's why it's bad. So we need concrete communities, transparent communities, right? So this, for example, here, it's transparency on top, and we desire democratic transparency in the bottom. Here is opaqueness on top, but we desire transparency, which is what we don't have, right? You can get a third theory which says capitalism is personal domination. It is in fact not even that distinguished from violent feudal societies or something like this. But that's why we need impersonal relations, which is like rationalism. So it accepts that capitalism is actually, let's say, barbaric and transparent, and it desires some level of abstraction as a solution, like Republican values, people are treated as equals formally, and things like this. So abstraction is good, but it's good because it's the end of violence, right? But you accept some level of impersonality as the solution. But you see both of these poles, this one and this one is nice because it has a better theory of domination, but it's also bad because it fights fire with water. It thinks an impersonal force will give space for a concrete form of life, local communities. outside of the market and you have like transparent relations with each other. And this also is a bit, not only does it not have a sophisticated theory, but it still wants to fight fire with water. It fights like capitalism with what is not of the same form of capitalism. But the one thing that is hard to find is the fourth one, which says impersonal domination should be fought with impersonal emancipation. And this is the one that I think we don't have yet, because it takes the abstract theory of domination with fluxes and tendencies and capitalist production being more automatic or autonomous, but it also doesn't want the solution to be local or immediate or transparent. It accepts that this is opaque and this is also opaque, right? I think that this is where Badiou is nice, because his theory of politics is like this. Like, for him, politics doesn't happen for people. It happens, for example, for organizations. Like, people don't see what they do politically. If you have a person here and a person here, and we're both in an organization, and we're, let's say, doing something, this something for us doesn't exist. Like, you cannot see it. It doesn't appear to you. It appears to the organization. And then your question is, how do you incorporate yourself in an organization that can intervene at this level? But things have kind of levels. So at this individual scale, this thing doesn't exist. It's only if you change the scale, so some level of abstraction to the organization, that you can intervene at this level, you know? So like in mediations, social forms, organizational forms, they are better equipped to touch the impersonal domination machine than personal powers. Like, it makes no sense to even desire for things to be less opaque, you know? The issue is how they are opaque. Like,
and Gabriel, do you think impersonal emancipation could take it in account the problem of average, for example?
Yeah, you would have to deal with those things. Like, how do you navigate? Like, I mean, this little arrow here, right? It is all about moving from local to something more global than you, of a higher scale, right? So how do you localize yourself in this level? It is a problem of coordination, sort of impersonal compulsion, why not, and things like this, right? I remember, for example, when this was very remarkable for me, because even though all the problems are obvious in Cuban society, I remember I was in Cuba sitting with a girl in a bar and some friends, and she like looked at her clock and she said at her watch and said, "Oh my God, I need to run. There is a town meeting, like a neighborhood meeting, to decide on some goods that are coming to the city. And I need to be there. Like, I hate it, but I need to be there." Like, that statement, like, I don't like it. I feel kind of compelled to do it. Like, it doesn't require you to like it, to be solidary with anyone. Like, it's not about you, you know? It's like, there's a minimal distance. You're allowed to hate everything. Like, you're not obliged to be a good person. It's not about the good person. It's about the thing working, right? So I remember I was crying so much. I saw she leaving the table. I was like, oh my God, I've never heard this statement before. She's so petty and hateful, and she hates all of it. And it doesn't matter, you know, like it's not about—
It works anyway.
It works anyway. Like, the statement, it works anyway, is not like a malevolent statement. It can work in different ways, right? To different ends. And I remember I was so struck by it, like, this is possible. So, I mean, I think that you can treat as you were saying, that it's like, you can treat the problem as a fault in let's say, the measuring tools for the system. Like, oh, this system, the way that it is, has a fault because we cannot get a good metric on the whole, or there is no transitivity or a bug in this transitive thing. but it can also be because social systems are not transitive, right? And the issue is, how do you exploit this in different ways? Like, how can we use the mismatch between scales in favor of society rather than against it, right? Like the equalization, I think that's a different way of putting it. Like, it doesn't mean that the best idea is to make these two things coincide or overlap or for example, I think an interesting example of this is perhaps in my opinion, one of the worst things that happened to us is that all the cool jargon for organizations was taken by capitalism before we had a chance. So do you realize how sad it is that words like venture, entrepreneur, like that describe getting together and trying something that you don't know where it's gonna go, you know? Like, they are totally colonized by capitalism. Like, every social adventure that goes somewhere that you don't know where it is has a capitalist connotation. But I mean, you know, in the ideal world, an entrepreneur would be like a militant. Like, that's a better name than militant. Like somebody who's navigating a space you don't know where it's going. Like, that's like how they described Ulysses. You know, that's a navigational metaphor. He was an entrepreneur, in fact. Like, that's where the metaphor probably comes from, I imagine. So it's crazy that we lost that. Like, why would anyone want to join a party with militants when they can join, you know, a venture capitalist thing? Like, oh my God, we totally fucked that up, you know?
That's true.
But I think it's a good signal of how the opaqueness can play a positive role for a very small elite, right? It's not a measure of how lost you are. It's also a measure of like that there are intra-society adventures. Like, you can, there's not only spatial travel from one place to another, but there is like time travel, like, which is what companies do. Like, how do we travel towards the future? That's what makes you a venture capitalist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, the notions of risk and of profit should be rehabilitated in a different way, right? I mean, there can be other meanings to the idea of profit that aren't capitalist.
Yeah, which is weird, right? I mean, that's the point. Like, that's one of those hard significations that is almost impossible to break. Like, nobody is gonna hear you talk that you're into venture organizations and not automatically think you're a capitalist, but that's a loss. Like, that's a failure of ours. That's not and we are always the conservative ones with this. Like, communists and socialists, they are the conservative guys on the complexity front. Like, hey guys, social responsibility, participation, all these terms, they seem nice, like morally nice, but libidinally flawed, you know? Like, they don't really inspire much. Like, nobody gets really, you know, excited for solidarity. Like, it is a bummer. Like, the best way to socially coordinate is to be constantly worried if you're thinking about all details of the problems of everyone else. Like, that's hell, right? Whereas capitalists are like, oh my God, this social space is unknowable. Let's try something and try to come back with the victory. You know, like, they get the upper hand.
It's like, we need to make like a communist version of the Facebook movie, you know?
Yes.
It's like you have an idea and you implement it, but it's, I don't know, the adventure is on the side of the people here, you know?
Yeah, the adventures of the that's actually the name of a book, I think.
Commodity, Adventures of Commodity, isn't it?
That's the Anselm Yap. Yeah, exactly. The adventure of commodities. Yeah.
Yes,
commodities have adventures. Yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, I don't know. I think that. Yeah.
No, especially the notion of risk. I think we should think about, because It's exactly what we were thinking. We were talking.
Yeah, I really think that there is something like, look at this. I just found here this quote. I really advise, I'm not sure if you guys know of this book called Cartography of the Absolute, but I find it like the best book on this topic I've read. Like it really shaped how I approach it. But just find here. Yeah, this is Perry Anderson when he was very young, talking about Swedish social democracy and the importance of a plan, right? And this is what he said: like the plan, having a social plan, it decodes the vast, interlocking, impenetrable, inspissated economy and ascribes a lucid meaning to every one of myriad cryptic gestures which compose it, renders the entire workforce transparent to itself as engaged in one task, so that each member of it can see how his own task complements and completes all of the others, and is in turn carried beyond itself by them. Everything possible should be done to maximize transparency of social construction. Transparency is one of the crucial defining characteristics of socialism. A community in which all multiple mediations between our public and private existence are visible, where each social event can be seen right back to its source, and legible human intentions read everywhere in the face of the world. Like, yeah.
It's like a psychotic notion.
It's kind of psychotic, exactly. Like, and it's like the weirdest sort of. I like that they go through this and they talk about a bunch of different theories. For example, this is Vertov talking about his movies. Like, the textile worker ought to see the worker in a factory making a machine essential to the textile worker. The worker at the machine tool plant ought to see the miner who gives his factory its essential fuel. The coal miner ought to see the peasant who produces the bread essential for him. Workers ought to see one another so that a close indissoluble bond can be established among them. Like, you know, like communitarian links. Which is weird. Like, capitalism dominated everything because it's all about impersonal bonds.
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to solve that by more personal, like by going back to a big community, you know? And like, I love that this chapter ends with, I think it's a really good kind of suggestion. He says, the aesthetic temptation, which is also political, is to treat the struggle against capital's abstract domination over human beings of capital as an automatic subject, of social forms that are invisible as they are ubiquitous, as a struggle for concrete community, a movement from the supersensible back to the sensible. But communism is not a mere negation of abstraction, form, and invisibility. It is their free functioning. In this sense, it is a determinate negation of a society traversed in the form of commodity by sensuously supersensible things. The point, though, is not to abrogate this aesthetic ambivalence of real abstractions for some abstract nostalgic desire for true life. It is to experiment with forms of social organization which, necessarily combining the sensuous and the supersensible, will not do so through the forms of equivalence founded on abstract commensurability of labor, time, and life. I find this a really good program, you know. The two things are not the same, right? To overcome equivalence based on abstract labor, abstract life and time is not the same as overcoming abstraction. On the contrary, like, it might become more necessary than ever. Like, you might even come up with even more radical forms of impersonal relations. You don't need to think of it in terms of reducing opaqueness. It might, in fact, be the contrary, right? Because what we were just talking about now is that competition is the proof that capitalists still require, I mean, they still desire some transparency to be able to know how to act. Like, it's part of the problem that everywhere fetishism is at work, right? There's no place where abstraction runs without kind of luring personal personal personifications, right? And this reminds me of something that I also find very nice, is that, you know, Frederick Jameson wrote an utopia called The American Utopia, which is very crazy. It was a very heated debate when it came out. He studied utopias for like 30, 40 years, and then he wrote his own. And his utopia is crazy because it's a military utopia. He says, in the United States, the only social structure that covers everyone, that can offer free health, free education, is the military. So my utopia begins with everyone going to the military. Like, this is our political act. One day, everyone, like, first we pass a law that the right-wingers love, which is the military accepts people from like 14 years old all the way to 70. And the right feels like, oh my God, like everyone is supporting our wars. But then everyone the next day joins the military. And this makes the structure of the army collapse because they cannot handle everyone. But now we have an integrated system, which is not the government, for distributing healthcare, education. So we reuse the money that goes into arms and weapons into the social system. But then he says something which I find amazing. He says, the moment that you do this, you create an impersonal relation between people because you're using the bureaucratic system. And this will increase social suffering because people were never so detached from one another as they will be in this utopia. Because things work regardless of if they like each other. Like, it just works. Like, nobody's gonna be hungry. So people who don't have a means to be eccentric will be eccentric. Like, if you already hate your neighbor because he listens to music very loud, can you imagine how much you will hate him when he does something much crazier with his time? Like, so social hatred actually goes up. And people, like, when they actually get the experience of impersonal relations that are not unequal, but equal impersonal relations, you need some mechanism so that people start being able to tolerate it, because nobody's ready for how intolerable it is to be free in that level, you know? And then he says, that's why psychoanalysis will become a state problem. There will be like a department of psychoanalysis in the government because social discontent will go up with communism, not down. And I find that very insightful, very, like, we never go that route when we think about these things. It's always like community, solidarity, but it doesn't necessarily be like that, right?
Yeah, that's great.
It's really, I really like this text.
Yeah, it's a wonderful argument.
Yeah.
By the way, guys, I have to go, but
yeah, no, me too.
Yeah.
Great discussion.
Yeah, man, it clarifies so much for me. Yeah.
Are we doing this next week or in 2 weeks?
If you guys are okay, I actually can move meetings for Mondays if that works for you guys. Then I can actually meet every Monday. It's up to you, whatever you prefer. We can talk through WhatsApp as well.
Okay.
To decide. But
Mondays are good for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'll let you. I'll give you guys my info there.
Then we divide what we're going to do and whatnot.
Yeah, I don't know if, I mean, Dennis said he had something he wanted to present on that generative stuff.
Yeah, I think it would be good. It plays off of everything we talked about here.
That's
just
amazing.
the idea of, how we can think about emergent or generative things and kind of map that onto this idea of price and value.
Sure. You want to try to do it next week? Do you think you can already do it?
Yeah. I think I mean, I'm not going to go that formal. I just think, having the idea would be really nice. Sure. And then we can have a discussion about it. Yeah.
Sure. Great. I'm free. Can do it.
Okay. Me too.
Great, guys.
So,
sleep well.
Bye.
Bye.
Sleep well. Take care.
Yeah.
You too.